So one of the most fascinating moments of the 100 Years' War has to be King Edward III's Crecy campaign, where he sailed across the Channel with an army of 15,000 strong, which was large by medieval standards, to reclaim his French lands. Edward landed his forces in Normandy to little resistance, and when he came ashore he tripped over and hit his head, but being the master of propaganda, Edward stood up and said that this was his sign that the land was ready to receive him, and that it was, as his lad's holiday got off to a fantastic start. Despite issuing orders for his troops not to raid and loot, Edward had little control of his men, as all the towns in northern France were raided and plundered of anything of value, known as a chevauchée. Edward probably didn't mind too much though, as an army with their pockets full of gold is a happy one, and his ability to devastate the richest lands in France with little resistance would have been insulting to the French king Philippe VI. The main French army was down in the southwest of France fighting in the siege of Aiguillon, but King Philippe ordered it back to Paris, along with every able-bodied man in northern France, to assemble to take on the English. Edward was now just 20 miles from Paris in the town of Poissy after devastating all these lands in his chevauchée, and Philippe now sent him an invitation for both sides to do battle. Edward agreed to do battle just south of the Seine River, and the French turned up on the selected day. However, the English didn't, and they burnt down the town of Poissy and now bolted north in what was an escape mission away from the French army. The French had carried out a scorched earth policy north of the Seine though, as they anticipated the English moving north, and now the army had to scatter far and wide to forage, all while being harassed by peasants of the local area and being chased by the French army in a forced march moving over 40 kilometers a day in what was now a cat and mouse chase across northern France. Despite the absolute carnage the English got up to in the first part of the campaign, Edward now had to put a leash on his men's looting, and they were directly executed for disobeying his orders, as time was of the essence and they had to cross the River Somme to resupply, as they were pretty hungry. The French had reached the river first though just a day prior, now howled or destroyed every single crossing along the River Somme, and while Edward was probing for a way across, he was informed by a French captive of a crossing near Blanchaquet up here, and he quickly marched towards it. A French force of around 3,000 were defending the crossing though, but Edward had to cross as the tide was only low for a few hours a day, and he had the entire French army up his arse, and the English longbowmen and knights soon forced the opposing French into a retreat. Edward managed to cross in a near miraculous escape, and the French were so close behind they captured some of the English wagons before only a few days later they'd meet at the Battle of Crecy. So English people are renowned for their absolutely awful tolerance to the slightest bit of hot weather, and this was in full effect in 1386 during John of Gaunt's disastrous lad's holiday across the kingdom of Castile to claim his rightful title as King of the Kingdom. John was son of the great English King Edward III and had claim to the Castilian throne for his second wife, Constance of Castile. However, he was never able to stake his claim to the crown until now. King of England Richard II had finally granted John enough funds to go on his campaign, and he landed in the northwest of Spain with around 7,000 men, as well as his wife and children, to win the Castilians' affection for his cause. John soon captured the holy city of Santiago de Compostela, which was a powerful statement, as if he could be accepted in the holiest city of all of Castile, the rest of the country was likely to back him. The invasion caught the current King of Castile, John I, completely off guard, as he was expecting it to come through Portugal, and while he was waiting for French reinforcements, he offered John a deal where his daughter and his son would be married, making his daughter the future King of Castile if only he relinquished his claim to the throne. In hindsight, this was a chance for peace that John of Gaunt probably should have accepted. However, he wasn't ready to give up his long-awaited Castilian campaign so easily and refused, and in response, John of Castile started employing scorched earth tactics across the land and waited for John of Gaunt's campaign to fall apart due to lack of supplies and his men dying of sickness. Now, with the English absolutely despising the sun and the campaign taking place in the hot summers of Spain, the men soon began to hate their life and longed for the cool rivers and lakes of France, and a point of contention was John bringing his wife and children along, slowing down the army. Sickness soon began to spread around the English camp, and while John of Gaunt wanted a decisive pitched battle to settle this once and for all, the English soldiers knew that the Spanish didn't actually have to fight them to kill them, and John's only options were to sue for peace or make an alliance with Portugal. A Portuguese alliance was arranged through the marriage of one of John's daughters and the extensions of Portuguese lands in Castile, and in return a joint invasion force would be launched, and the new year promised an exciting victory for John. However, one small problem came up when it was found out that John's new son-in-law had actually agreed to vows of chastity previously for another order, so the marriage had to wait a few more months for the Pope to approve it. The delay agitated the English army even further, as they now had to sit around and wait in the hot heat doing absolutely nothing, all while succumbing to dysentery and infection. The marriage went ahead, but goodwill between the English and Portuguese soon broke down as they were fighting over loot in raided towns, and as the hot summer once again approached, the English were drinking heavy Portuguese wine in an attempt to cure their thirst, but in turn it made them more dehydrated. As they were marching through the hot and sticky heat, English soldiers started stripping off their clothes in an attempt to keep cool. However, at night, the temperatures dropped to freezing, and along with the heavy wine they were drinking, they began to get extremely sick again. John was losing his best men and closest friends in the process, and his army was scared, exhausted, desperate to go home, and ready to desert at any minute, likely destroying John's morale in the process. He had to come to terms with the massive loss of life, losing around half his army in the process, and now had to give up his dream of taking the Castilian crown. He soon made an agreement with John of Castile for the previous marriage arrangement to go ahead, where John's daughter would be the future Queen of Castile, and in return, John became one of the wealthiest men in England, but it was all for his dream of the Castilian crown. So one of the most fascinating moments of the Middle Ages has to be Prince Edward's crusade in 1272, which was pretty much a disaster from start to finish, and it seemed like nothing went right for him. After Simon de Montfort's defeat in 1265 at the Battle of Evesham, and the Second Barons' War had pretty much come to an end, Edward wasn't really that interested in dealing in the political aftermath of England, and wanted a new adventure to test his skills as a warrior. Current King of England and Edward's father, Henry III, had been promising England a chance to take the cross for years, and now, with the rebellion all but crushed, it was the perfect opportunity. However, he wouldn't go, as he was a bit old and a bit too indecisive whether he wanted to or not. The crusade was to be led by King Louis IX of France, however obtaining money was a tough ask for Edward, with nobles not keen to raise taxes after they've just been through a war caused by raising taxes. To help with his funds, Louis gave Edward a loan of around £17,500, but this still wasn't enough. However, Louis said, "We're leaving on the 18th of August from the south of France, whether you're there or not." Edward did finally manage to raise enough funds for his campaign through a few controversial policies, but it was a delayed process, and he left England on the 20th of August, 2 days after the French deadline, with the original goal of the crusade to support the Christian city of Acre in Jerusalem. Edward covered over 600 miles in a month to get to the meeting point, and to no surprise, Louis had already left in early July, probably aware of Edward's delay. The big surprise though was the direction they travelled. Instead of heading east to Acre, they instead went south to the city of Tunis on the African coast on the advice of Louis' younger brother, Charles of Anjou, who was the king of Sicily at this time, probably because he wanted to expand his Mediterranean empire. Edward only had a small force of around 225 knights, so had no choice but to follow them. However, it was all in vain, as after only a few days that Edward had set off from England on the 25th of August, a plague had struck the French camp, claiming the life of Louis IX. By the time Edward arrived in Tunis, a peace treaty had already been signed, and it was agreed the Crusaders would go to Sicily to plan further action. It was decided they would postpone until spring of the next year. However, a pretty savage storm hit Sicily, dissuading the French further after the death of their king, and they soon head back. Edward, though, was not to be dissuaded and set off towards Acre, arriving in May of 1271. Acre was the centre of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and Edward's reinforcements provided a big boost to the demoralised garrison, as the Holy Land was being attacked by Sultan Baybars and his massive army. Baybars was in Christian Tripoli, but upon hearing news of Edward's arrival, soon marched south to harass them, and the English soon found that the hot summers of the Middle East weren't the best time to don a male shirt, with many passing to dehydration. A lifeline though appeared for Edward, with the Mongols in the north attacking Aleppo, distracting Baybars' forces, and they soon marched north to deal with it. All of the time, the Crusaders attacked the city of Kokkan. However, the Mongols soon withdrew upon hearing news of Baybars marching towards them, and the assaults on the city of Kokkan failed massively, and the situation in the Holy Land was growing desperate, and a 10-year peace treaty was soon agreed between the King of Jerusalem and Baybars. Edward wasn't too pleased at this ceasefire though, and was now seen as a loose cannon by many, ready to disrupt the peace, and everyone was keen to see the back of him after many welcomed his arrival. Accounts of what happened next are a bit conflicting, but Edward was the victim of an assassination attempt, and he was pierced by a poisoned blade before he overthrew his attacker. Edward survived, and although he hadn't passed, the assassination attempt had worked, as Edward now decided to abandon his campaign and set sail home to England. However, after arriving in Sicily, Edward was now met with the news that he was the new King of England after his father had passed on his campaign.